Okay, got it. So if you don't want to be seen, please turn off your camera. So the point of recording is that we'd like to be able to use this this webinar presentation at a later date, particularly as we begin our grant cycle in 2024, and as a possibility for people to be able to access it when they need it. So we will be recording. Please keep yourselves on mute when you're not speaking. If you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand virtually or physically, as the camera will allow. Or you can put your question in the chat, and I or Carrie will be monitoring it, and so we can ask your question on your behalf. So thank you again for taking time to join us for this session. Our goals for today, if you want to advance that slide, Carrie, that'd be great. Sorry, I was supposed to tell you about African American Legacy. Let me just do that first to put this in context. So the African American Legacy is a affinity group within the Chicago Community Trust. Its goal is to both support issues that are of import to African Americans in the Chicago metropolitan area, as well as to provide support for African American community-based organizations who are serving the African American community. We do two things in addition to providing some technical assistance and raising issues that are of importance to this community. One aspect of the programming for African American Legacy is, I'm not sure what just happened, but okay, is to provide a grant program we have once a year, and over the years, the Affinity Fund has awarded over $4.5 million in grants to over 100 organizations. Okay, thanks, Rita. And so this is part of our efforts to not only support the community through actual grant dollars. Our endeavor is always to provide support to organizations through strategic community capacity building activities, and this is one of those attempts. Next slide, Carrie. So we're here in part, this particular capacity building effort came about as we began to look at the board configurations of the applicants that submitted applications this year in 2023. What we noticed is that about 40% of those applicants had board of directors where the ED or president was also the board chair. And that raised some concern for us, particularly in the area of accountability, as well as trying to think about long-term impacts that would have institutionally for the organization and organizations' abilities to raise revenue from other grant makers. And so we decided that we would want to try to put this informational session together. The other reality that we saw as we were sort of engaging organizations in conversations about their needs, we saw instances in which there were perhaps just one staff person, and I think it's attributable just to the challenge of funding, or an ED who had been with the organization for a while. And what concerned us there was what happened, what would happen to that institution should the ED have to have, there's some kind of transition. And so the other interest for us was like, how are we supporting organizations as they think about long-term sustainability and governance? So that is the backdrop for how we came to this particular session and why we're here. Carrie, if you could advance to the next slide, please. And so our goals today are essentially, we want to make sure that We are educating grantees and other nonprofit stakeholders about the role of the board of directors. We want to make sure that we help nonprofit organizations better understand why it is not best practice to have the executive director serve as the board chair. And then finally, we wanted to explore how organizations might minimize the vulnerability of transition by thinking about succession planning. So with that, let's get started. I would like to introduce our guest experts for today. Kira, you'd advance to the next slide, please. And we have two really wonderful human beings who have, one of whom is a lifetime board director for African American Legacy, and one who's a current board member for the African American Legacy. So I'm going to just a quick overview of their bios. Marguerite H. Griffin is a senior vice president at Northern Trust. As a director of philanthropic advisory service, Marguerite is responsible for developing and delivering Northern Trust philanthropic advisory services to wealth management clients. She is certified as a multi-generational philanthropy facilitator with 2164 and a member of the 2164 Advisors of Color Advisory Board. Marguerite has received her BA degree from Washington University in St. Louis and her JD degree from Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. She is also credentialed in mediation training with the Center for Conflict Resolution. And Marguerite, as I've alluded to, has served on numerous boards. And currently, I think, is a board member with the Poetry Foundation and an active volunteer and planning giving advisor with several charitable and cultural institutions and giving circles, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Celebrant Institute and Foundation, the Celebrant Institute and Foundation, Chicago Foundation for Women, the African American Legacy at Chicago Community Trust, and she's also a Leadership Greater Chicago Fellow and a member of the Leadership Fellow Associations. Joining us also is Natasha L. Holmes, Esquire, who founded Macmillan Homes LLC in 2016. She's an alumnus of the ABA's Judicial Internship Opportunity Program, where she served as the extern to the Honorable Arlander Keyes, a retired federal magistrate of the Northern District of Illinois. Prior to starting her law practice, Ms. Holmes served as alderman for the city of Chicago's 7th Ward, bringing to that role her more than 15 years of experience working at the local, state, and federal level as a senior advisor in state government and the nonprofit sector on issues surrounding public policy. Her professional and educational background provides a wealth of knowledge and resources to her clients. She holds a bachelor's in science from Alabama State University's College of Education, a master of ceremony planning from Auburn University's College of Architecture, Design, and Construction, and a JD from the Illinois Institute of Technology's Chicago Kent College of Law. And she too is a current member of the African American Legacy Fund at the Chicago Community Trust and the Historic Pullman Foundation. So as you can tell, we've got some super heavy hitters here, really talented, quite qualified, who are sure to give us some really wonderful kernels of wisdom that we can take away and use in our respective organizations. So with that, Carrie, can you advance to the next slide? Thank you. So the conversation more broadly today will be about governance. What I will do is we'll start with Marguerite and focus on the role of the board of directors and have as honest a conversation as we can about the board, what board of directors do, and why we at African American Legacy don't believe that it is best practice to have the board chair be the organization's executive director. So I'll just ask Marguerite to have a couple of slides up, but we'll be asking Marguerite some questions. Again, feel free to either, if you have questions as she's answering my questions, if you'd like to put those in the chat, feel free to do so, or to raise your hand, or physically and hopefully we can see that I can't see anybody currently, and or to raise um, your button in Zoom. So Marguerite, thank you for your time and your willingness to step in and answer some questions. So there's a next slide, please, Carrie. So there's a small definition I've put up here to describe what a nonprofit board of director is, but perhaps you could kick us off with this question. So for you, what is a board of director?
Yeah, thank you, Consuelo. I'm so happy to be here and so happy to really participate in the African American legacy after many, many years in a really concrete way. And I so appreciate that the African American legacy is still really focused on capacity building for nonprofits. Whether you receive a grant or not, this is really a way to help every nonprofit really kind of leverage the resources that they have and build strength within their organization. So I think this is a great definition, what you have here for everyone. Essentially, I'd like to say that a board of directors, specifically a nonprofit board of directors, is a group of individuals who are elected in most cases. In some cases, they might be appointed to govern and oversee the organization's operations. And we'll come back to those words, govern and oversee. You are really responsible. The board is responsible for setting the organization's mission, strategy, and goals, and ensuring that the organization is operating in compliance with legal and ethical standards. So essentially, the board of directors is responsible for protecting the mission and ensuring the organization's financial viability.
Thank you. And how many board of directors legally does a nonprofit operating in Illinois have to have?
Yeah, I believe that number is 3 or more, and it has to be provided for in the organization's bylaws. So all nonprofit organizations, the law in Illinois that applies is the Nonprofit Corporation Act. And that is the place to look to find out what legal documents you need to have in place in order for the nonprofit organization to be legally viable and recognized. And I believe it's 3 or more
Thank
directors.
you. Yes, yes. So remember, you have to have at least 3 people.
Yeah.
And hopefully their last names are not the same as your last name.
Yeah.
We often see that. So maybe to the next slide, Carrie. So Margaret, can you talk a little bit about the connection? I know you talked about governance and oversight. And so can you talk a little bit about the connection, what the connection should be between there you go. The connection between the board of directors and the executive director.
Sure. So that connection is different from the slide here, but the slide here I think we need to speak to because that's what really sets up the organizational kind of structure or infrastructure or scaffolding for the work that the organization is going to be doing. There are 3 duties that fiduciary duties that a board has. It's the duty of care, and that essentially is to practice due diligence, care, and skill. You need to know what's going on at the organization. You need to be informed. You need to ask questions. The duty of loyalty essentially is to act in the organization's best interest. And this comes up in the context of minimizing conflicts of interest. So you want to make sure that what you're doing is then first in the organization's best interest as you as a board member. And then there's the duty of obedience, which is really ensuring that the organization adheres to its mission and purposes. So that's back to, 2 primary responsibilities of protecting the mission and financial viability. So the connection between the board and the executive director or the board and staff is essentially the board is responsible for running the organization. The board is responsible for the mission. The board will delegate its responsibilities to an executive director and staff. The board is there to govern and to set policy and to set strategy. The executive director and the staff is there to carry out the policy, the strategy, everything that the board says, this is what's going to be helpful to the organization. So it's a governance and management relationship. Governance, not necessarily involved in the day-to-day. Management, definitely involved in the day-to-day, but not responsible necessarily for setting the strategy and for developing the policies. That's really the role of the board. I can go on about this, but maybe if that's enough for where we are, or if you have another question about that, I'll go in a little bit deeper.
So here's perhaps I'm getting to this other part about the relationship between the board and the executive director, and so perhaps this is my softball lob, which is whose task is it to hire, retain, terminate, or evaluate an executive director?
Yeah, so that is the board's responsibility. And this is getting to why these two roles need to be separated. So the board, again, is the governing body. They are essentially saying, we can't do all of this work. We need someone who's going to be there every day to carry out the mission of this organization. We're going to hire someone to do that. But we also want that person to, we want to be able to have the right structure in place so we can evaluate this person's work, because legally we're responsible to the people who give us money, to the constituents, to the attorney general, for making sure that this organization is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And we just happen to delegate that to an executive director. So if they're not doing that, we need to be able to have some measure of control over whether that person remains in the role or whether we move on or whether they get training. So ongoing evaluation every year of the executive director is completely appropriate and should be happening. You might find that sometimes the board is kind of lax, you know, things are going well. They're just so happy that they don't have to do all the day-to-day work, that they let the executive director just kind of do whatever he or she wants. And they generally are the person that are carrying the fire of the mission, but there should be an annual review of the executive director, which means that if that person is also on the board or chair of the board, it's a question of whether that accountability is really there. And again, the fiduciary duties are such that if the attorney general or if a donor came back and said, hey, you said you were going to do this, you didn't do it, I gave you money, someone's going to be legally liable for that mismatch, so to speak. So we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, there are times where the executive director can be on the board, either having a voting position or non-voting, but they absolutely should not be chair of the board. And we can talk a little bit more about why that doesn't work.
Wow. Okay, well, let's get in. So you're saying that a board, so an ED or a president of an organization can sit on the board. And you're also saying they could perhaps be a voting member or an ex-officio member. Is there a recommendation from in terms of best practices that you've seen, Marguerite, as to how that ED should be sitting on the board?
Yeah, so there's a recommendation. So the ED's presence at the board is really to inform the board so that they can then carry out their duty of care and loyalty. So what is going on with the organization. What do the finances look like? What do the programs look like? What are our efforts as it relates to fundraising, et cetera? They're there to inform the entities or the individuals that hired them, give them an update of what's going on. Now, if it's necessary for them to vote, perhaps they are breaking a tie. That's a possibility. But my recommendation is that they not have any voting privileges on as a board member. They can be there for the board meeting for those areas or those issues that do not directly affect their salary or whether they're doing a good job or their evaluation, because the board needs the ED to inform them as to what's going on and to be able to ask questions. There was I think this was Board Source that had a report maybe a couple of years ago, and it was a national index of nonprofit board practices. And I think in that they found that only 12% of the respondents had the CEO or the executive director as a voting member of the board. So it's pretty rare that they are voting members. My recommendation would be not to have them in any kind of voting capacity. So a non-voting member of the board would be appropriate. Because again, thinking about the difference between management and governance, the ED is there at the behest of the board to help the board carry out the mission of the organization. That's essentially the role of the executive director. And this might be, if I'm a founding ED, I may feel very differently about that. I may feel that, well, I'm the one who started this. I'm the one who had the vision. I have the passion. I roll up my sleeves every day. I'm in charge. But that mindset is really not consistent with Illinois law and the Nonprofit Corporation Act. It really is, you are a steward working on behalf of this mission. And once you start collecting money from the public, the organization itself is there for the public good. And in that way, it's not really your organization anymore. You may have had the idea, but in order for you to get the tax exempt status, for you to raise money, for you to carry out that mission, it really means that you need to have a structure where you have an independent board and you can run the programs and be the one out in front, but there's not an ownership interest. It's not really about you. It really should always be about the mission.
Wow. Okay. Hopefully that's folks are hearing that. So I've heard this, Marguerite, when I go out and talk to organizations, particularly as we talk about founding executive directors, and then we'll get Natasha to jump in a second. So what I hear founding executive directors say to me is, but Consuela, I built this thing, and I hear you talk about the public good. What is there some way? So if the issue is about losing control, and I thank you for helping us remember that this is really about the public good. And when you've received funding, then there's a level of accountability that ought to be there. But if I were to, are there some ways? And I know you alluded to bylaws, so maybe we can go there. Are there some ways for the founding executive director who is concerned about his or her role in the organization to protect an interest there, or not? What's your thinking about that?
Absolutely. So there is this separation between governance and management, but an executive director has an extremely influential role in how the organization is led, all of the activities, and what policies and programs actually get put into place. The best way for the executive director to not have the board sort of go off, in this direction, which is very different than what he or she may have wanted, is to always be in communication with the board. couple of things, and maybe Natasha will talk a little bit about this, but a founding director really needs to be thinking from day one how long they're going to be in that role. 10 years, let's just say in 10 years, I want to get this organization to the place where anyone can step in and lead. Keeping that in mind, because you're on the ground doing the work and you have this relationship with the board, setting up a structure where that you are always in communication with the board, not just reporting out, but also saying, given the current circumstances, given the needs of the community, it is my understanding and my belief that we need to be doing X, Y, and Z, and we need to complete that within the next 6 months. And then you communicate again. We've been doing this for 6 months, and here is the impact and the success of our efforts. So this information loop is key to making sure that the executive director, who wants to be in charge and wants to be the one making the decision, can preserve as much of that within what's legally appropriate for themselves. So, and the board is going to be deferential to an executive director that helps them fulfill their fiduciary responsibilities of care, loyalty, and obedience. They're going to love that executive director because they are being informed. And if the executive director says we need to move left or right or left, the board is essentially going to say, yes, because we have faith in the work that you're doing, we're going to, continue to govern and say that this is okay. So many times we have the executive director who really knows what's going on, and they're not communicating with the board. They see the board as being something that is a nuisance. Oh, I just have to have this because it's Illinois law. When in fact, they should be thinking of the board as advocates for them and for the work, as their foot soldiers, as another way to amplify the work that's going on. And most importantly, if they've chosen good board members, advisors to them so that they can be more effective and more impactful with the work. The decisions of what's going on, executive directors may feel like they have to do everything. And many executive directors, don't get me wrong, they wear a lot of hats. But if you think of your board as a resource, advisors, advocates, stewards working with you, you're going to be much more successful. And the way to get people on board to help support those efforts is to keep them informed.
Wow, thank you so much, Marguerite. So we will have a question and answer segment. So if you want to, if there's some things that you, and I didn't see anything in the chat or any hands raised just yet. So if there are some questions that you have for Marguerite, there will be another time to ask her these questions. So with that, and you beautifully teed up this next segment, which is to sort of think, and I think you said that a good executive director is thinking from day one, like how long, what's the succession process, what's the succession planning, and so could we switch to Natasha and ask you to, Natasha, if hopefully you're still there, what do you say to this question of cementing one's legacy as a founding executive director or CEO? How do you see that sort of playing out in your own sort of experience of engaging nonprofit organizations?
So I just want to build on what, Marguerite just mentioned in terms of, when you're the executive director, when you're starting out an organization, let's just say, so whatever, capacity that is, as you're just starting out, you're spending a lot of time on developing your value, your mission, and those are really the basic principles that are going to guide the decision-making. And so when you're thinking about what legacy you yourself are placing on this organization, I think there are a few things that come to mind. So number one is, you're going to, after these policies and these governing and management procedures are put into place, it's really an opportunity to think about what type of culture and staff you're building. And then you're also going to have to think about what type of changes are going to occur over the course of, short, mid, and long-term aspects of the organization. And I think the legacy component really provides an opportunity for continual growth, improvement, and leading a positive work environment and leaving a positive mark on the world. I think sometimes what gets lost is what Marguerite mentioned, which is the purpose is for you to go do good. You set up, you're very passionate, you have a lot of energy directed toward this passion. You want to build an organization of strong people who are like-minded and believe in the mission and goals and furtherance of what the organization sets out to do. But the end result is to make sure that your product is, I'm saying product, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound commercial, but that what you're presenting to the world is something good and of value to folks in your community and surrounding and the people of whom you're trying to be of service.
Thanks, Natasha. And I just have put on this, we've moved advance this slide. It's this interesting quote from the National Council on Nonprofits that says that boards need to understand that succession planning is a risk management strategy to ensure the sustainability of the organization. So my question is, to you then, this is obviously the critical reason for why succession planning is important to nonprofit organizations. But can you, for instance, particularly where there's a founding executive director who has a few or no staff, how do they begin? How are they going to begin to think about this risk management mitigation?
So I think so first is you started this organization, you want it to continue. And I understand that often there is a very emotional attachment when you start an organization because you spent time and effort and energy and focus to just get up and running. But the longevity of the organization and the continuing of the mission is also important. And, one of the other things or there are several that I could just point out in terms of just topics, and I can go to them because I kind of made a little list. So, there's the institutional knowledge transfer, there's stability and confidence, there's the development of professionals that you're working with to ensure that they're in a position to take on the mission of the organization, and avoiding a crisis. If you're a single, you're the ED, you're the CEO, something happens to you, then what happens to that knowledge? What happens to how the organization operates? So it's almost as if as you're setting up your organization and you're creating your bylaws, essentially what in the business community considers an operating plan, when you're creating this plan of how you want this organization to run, these are important considerations. And just to kind of speak to, because Marguerite touched on donors and stability for donors, they want to make sure that your organization is going to still be able to operate in the event that something happens to the person in charge. So having a plan in place that really provides an opportunity for the person in charge to be able to transfer knowledge. It also provides an opportunity for all of the employees to then learn and grow so that they feel just as attached to the mission and the purpose as the founding member.
Thank you. Carrie, maybe next slide if you. And then Natasha, while she's advancing, and I'm sorry, maybe we're happy to share this deck with anybody that wants it. So what do you see as some of the potential challenges and opportunities to create you've talked about transfer of knowledge, ensuring donor confidence, ensuring that the mission and the organization continue to thrive and live on. So I think those are some of the opportunities to create a succession plan. What do you think may be some of the challenges that perhaps prevent people from, or boards or EDs from, talking about this really important topic?
So number one, I think it's the emotional attachment. And that is because, again, it's your baby, it's what you started, it's what you put this effort into. And so it's like letting it go is not as easy as it sounds. I also think that not-for-profits, especially smaller ones, they have limited resources. So, to put your time and to invest it into a succession plan may not be a high priority when you're just trying to operate on a daily basis. And I think another challenge is being in a position to identify who you want to be that successor in interest, if you will. Like who are you looking at? Who are you developing? And again, these challenges for smaller not-for-profits in particular are hard, because oftentimes when you're starting out, you really have a limited staff. So you're really not thinking beyond, your current operational needs and meeting the mission that you desire. But, as you grow and I think Marguerite gave a good timeline in terms of thinking of a plan 10 years or, a mid-year, then a longer term plan to address some of these issues. And if you have your board engaged at the onset of this, when you're thinking about how you want your organization to grow, it can be a part of, an annual strategic planning process where you're looking and evaluating on your needs, assessing how you're able to grow, getting more connected through donor opportunities. Then you're putting yourself in a position to allow this to naturally evolve as a part of the organization. But, again, I think for smaller nonprofits, I think early on when you're setting up your bylaws is to look at making sure that you're opening a pipeline, particularly focusing on those staff that you have most immediately, and also in the networks that you develop through various, nonprofit organizational groups out there.
Thank you, Natasha. So then the last question, then we'll just open it up for questions and answers because we had 2:45. So what do you think? So we had one elephant in the room, which is just about, this sort of ownership or the perception of owning something as perhaps the challenge for why there may be an ED who's also the board chair. The second elephant in the room I'm going to ask you about. So in the organization, who should initiate the conversation about succession planning and why?
So ideally, you would want it to be a collective effort of all parties involved. So you want your board involved, you want the executive director, you even want staff involved. But again, it depends on where you are as an organization at the time you're considering this. But there are some, the executive director, that really shows leadership. If they were to take the lead in starting the conversation about a succession plan, obviously the board is a very instrumental component to starting that conversation. And again, also noting limited resources, but sometimes it's necessary to get a consultant or consult with someone who focuses on this, and this is a part of their practice and what they do, and they're able to assist. Because again, if we think back to this emotional attachment aspect of it, it's often hard to say, hey, I need to start planning for when I'm not here. right? And that's not always comfortable for people. But when we connect it to kind of what you've laid out in on the agenda, when you talk about, well, what legacy do you want to leave? And it, you know, this mission is important and it's for the public good. How are we to make sure that this continues to carry on? So it has to be that initial, excuse me, broad thinking at the start. And like I said, it would be great if the executive director started that conversation. But at the same time, I think that it's an ongoing conversation that happens as a part of strategic annual assessment of how the organization is growing. And I would just like to add, excuse me, as an aside, another board that I'm on, we actually do have an executive director who is leaving. And, you know, he actually, and he's been there for a short time, and the board is actually in a transitional phase from being very much volunteer board directed to actually having staff. But what his resignation has done is allowed the board to start having these conversations about transition planning and succession, and you know, and also the executive director who is leaving is very instrumental in that. He's been able to like look at organizational either structure, things that he's learned over the course of his tenure. He's seen how, you know, again, this board is in a transitional phase, but because of that, it's making this process a lot easier. It's never easy when you have someone at the helm who does have an extreme knowledge base, knows where all the buttons are that need to be pushed and when the lights need to go on and off. But at the same time, you do want a person who exhibits, you know, the leadership capability to be able to say, okay, in the event that I leave or during this transition, I want to make sure it's smooth. I want to make sure all the parties are involved effectively. And, you know, it makes it easier once a new person, if that person is not already a part of the organization, to come in. And also, I think the presentation of a good board that supports the work of the executive director and staff also makes these conversations and these transitions a lot easier.
Thanks, Natasha. Carrie, if you could just advance to the next slide. We're just going to go just to quickly, for anybody that wants, as a resource, board source has offered a timeline for an executive transition, which is really valuable for organizations to be thinking about. Some things to, in terms of just so this horizon, when you're, you know, so we've talked about bylaws a couple of times. And so, you know, either for those folks that are kind of founding executive directors and you're kind of just putting your bylaws together, I think Marguerite and Natasha are sort of pushing us all to think about, you know, how we might use those bylaws, either by setting up a nominating committee, by sort of spelling out the process for how transitions will be handled at the executive director level, and perhaps embedded in just the organizational culture, and I often hear executive directors say to me, well, Consuelo, we don't even get, you know, we don't get reviews, and the nature of sadly the sector is when things are going well, they're going really well, and our inclination is not to rock the boat. And so sometimes I've heard from executive directors that they don't get evaluations, they don't get annual performance reviews. That too, I would say, is part of the succession planning, is to be able to, for the board to talk to the executive director, and the executive director talk to the board about expectations. And it is at that time, perhaps during that annual review, that you know, a conversation could be had. So how are you feeling? How's the board feeling about, you know, your leadership, and where are you? So I think it is, in my mind, always best for there to be as much transparency as possible in those conversations, and that there is I think one of the bigger tools in this discussion around succession planning is are your bylaws. Carrie, next slide, please. So we'll just open it up for anybody that has questions for either Marguerite or Natasha. We've got about 8 minutes, and then I'm going to ask Marguerite and Natasha for final words of wisdom that they want to send you off with. So, are there any questions? Feel free to come off mic. I don't see any questions in the chat, but you've got two great guest experts, so feel free to ask either of them anything that you'd like to ask them.
Hi, Consuelo. This is Gloria with Black Star, and I just want to say thank you. This is great. This is exactly what I needed to hear. I sort of stepped into the role of ED and chair upon the death of our founder, Mr. Jackson, Philip Jackson. But I have been having these succession conversations with my staff and with my board. And so thank you so much for presenting this. This is exactly what I needed to hear to give me that push that I need to really start moving in that direction. But there was something said about, the transfer of institutional knowledge and the history of the organization and so many other things that are a concern. And so I think there's a young man on the call who is a part of my staff. And so he knows that this is important to me and it's important to our organization. And so thank you for Marguerite and Natasha. Natasha, I may have met you. I worked at IIT for a couple of years with Francine Shalunas. So you may remember
I think I met you on a site visit, actually.
Yes. And that too. Exactly. Good to see you again. But thank you so much. This is such important information for small and larger organizations. We're a smaller organization and we'll be taking this information to heart. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Gloria. And you mean you've already lived this, but perhaps, I don't know, as a question, it's a really valuable one. And I too am thinking about this on a board that I'm on. Maybe Margarita or Natasha or both. So what are your thoughts around archiving and the transfer of knowledge? Are there some things that you've seen in your own work that others might sort of learn from, or suggestions on how people might tackle this question about capturing the history and the sort of that institutional memory that certainly is the biggest part of the transition, because it's often the thing that is lost. So either one of you, I don't know, if either of you want to kind of sort of take that on.
Marguerite, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. It had to happen at least once, right? It's a really important question, and it's one of the reasons why I think transitions are so hard, because people say, well, if they leave, we will lose this. We will lose this history. We will lose this institutional knowledge. But here's an area where technology really can help. And I'm going to just suggest a couple of ways that I've known organizations do this. They will create podcasts, or the equivalent of like a podcast. So first they come up with several questions under various different categories. What is it that we would want someone to know about this organization and what we're doing today? What is it that we want people to know about our history and how we got here? What is it that we want people to know about our hopes and dreams and aspirations about where this organization is going to go? So you have these kind of categories, and under there you have certain questions. How do we get things done? The last time we had to go to the city to get licenses, what did we do? Who are our contacts? And you just essentially just record that. You have the person who has that institutional knowledge either write it down or an easy way to do it would be in a podcast format where you have somebody asking the questions and the person with the institutional knowledge responds. And that way, in very much the same way that Consuela set up this call today, you record it, it's there, people can tap into it. And if you're smart about the questions that you want to ask and have answers to, and how you're going to categorize them, anyone stepping in will know all of those little secret things about how things get done. They'll have the benefit of the executive director and his or her experience, even when they are not present. So that's one way that I've seen it happen. And it's easy, it's quick. You can do it in the moment. We always have someone come in and look at this aspect of our work, or we have an evaluation. Let's just get this down for posterity. Let's create a historical record so that we can go back to it, or people who are here when we're not can go back to it and learn from it.
Thanks, Marguerite. Natasha, did you want to jump in? If not, I could offer.
No, Marguerite is very new school, and that is great and awesome. And also, that is the way of the world right now. I mean, we are doing things on a more like visual video. I strongly encourage that. Also, there's very good record keeping, and good policies and procedures about record keeping. I think that that's really important as well, because I think Marguerite gave a great example. What did we do when we went to the city and got this permit for this, or went to an agency and needed something? And I mean, having those policies and procedures, and being mindful that, agencies are going to change their policies at times, but having an understanding and a framework, keeping notes on who that person was and that office that you spoke with, it goes, really a lot of the structure of how you operate really should be based on your bylaws and whatever policies and procedures come out of that, and developing something that deals with record keeping and how you approach certain situations, I think is it supplements. And obviously videos, that is the way of the world now in terms of being able to access information.
Thanks, Natasha. Two other things to think about on that front, and then I know we're a little bit over time. I don't know if Marguerite or Natasha can stick around for 5 more minutes. Is to and I think about Gloria Yu and Phil Jackson, and Phil Jackson in particular. So I've had just recently talked to some West Siders who had not heard of him. So 2 other places for possible institutional knowledge transfer and retention. And I love this idea, Natasha, are really paying attention to the document retention policies institutionally, because that's another area I think that people don't think about. Like, how long do we retain these documents? Where are we going to put them? Is to sort of invite you all, if you are community-based and you're in a local, you have a neighborhood focus, is to look at the local library and perhaps share some archival materials with that library as another step or way to keep that memory alive, and to draw on other institutional partners. So that was my second, sort of the learning for me, is that other people have access to your history as well, and so don't forget them. If you worked with partners or if they're funders that have had a keen sense of the organization over years, they too might be a place to go for that information. One more question, perhaps, before I ask Natasha and Marguerite to close with some wisdom.
I think Michael has his hand raised.
Michael, I apologize. Michael, please, I can't see.
That's correct. I'm the young man Miss Gloria spoke of. It's on her team. And this call majorly, I've learned a lot. Considering my background is not directly in business, I'm more of a chemistry and math guy. And so I can appreciate these definitions and practice how these things are supposed to go and kind of what happens in reality. The focus seems to have been surrounding the succession on the executive director side and how the board can play into that. I just had a question surrounding what in operations could be done to help or assist with this? Is it best just to keep things stabilized, or are there particular procedures that you guys recommend that someone in middle management or that's rising to middle management do in order to help in this process?
Natasha, you want to kick us off, and then Marguerite, or I can't. I am out.
I was gonna ask Marguerite to kick it off.
Marguerite, any
I mean, I'll just
suggestions?
say that. I mean, I think I would say from an we are focusing on the, you know, executive director, board chair kind of relationship, and that being a single person. So that's kind of, you know, why this was pointedly that way. But I would just say from the perspective when you're assessing your organization overall, and like I said, these are annual, semi-annual opportunities to kind of strategically plan. I think you're looking at the entire organization as a whole. You know, from an AAL, and I'll just speak to organizations that we've dealt with and funded. I think we see these small organizations that are, you know, 2 or 3 staff, but are doing great work. And the focus has to be more on how can we develop, you know, our staff in the staff model, as well as continue to be able to do work in the same vein and with the same passion and energy that, you know, the organization is purposed for. So I don't think it's leaving out kind of the middle staff part of this. I think it's more that our experience is that we've had more of these situations where it's a smaller staff, it's just the board chair and the executive director, and even in that they're wearing several different hats still. So I think that, but I think overall you'd want to apply this throughout your organization.
Yeah, and I would just say that succession planning will mean leadership development at the same time. You can't have a good succession plan without recognizing where the talent is currently, where you want it to be internally with the organization. So as you're thinking about, you know, succession planning at that high level, it will mean that you need to think about, or maybe even create a matrix or a grid. What talent, what skills do we have on the staff currently? What skills do we need? What would it take to move this person from this position up to a higher level? So that just means a healthy relationship. You got to know what resources you've got, what resources you need, and who are the likely candidates who be able to deliver that. And it's to the organization's benefit to look internally first to try to find those skills to kind of fill those gaps where they can, because, you know, that person, if they're on staff, they already believe that the mission is important, and they've already shown their commitment to the mission.
Thank you. So the last question, and then if you didn't get you have a question and you didn't get an answer, please feel free to send it to alchicago@cct.org, and one of us will get back to you. And then I want to just offer the framework of to this last question. Position descriptions, operation plans are always useful. So let's start with, I see Marguerite, so we'll start with Marguerite in the closing. Any last thoughts that you want to share as we close, and then we'll ask Natasha the same question.
I guess I would say that, you know, a healthy nonprofit is more than just an influential, charismatic, capable, competent leader. And if you're not thinking about the whole organization comprehensively, you're always going to be at risk of anything happening. I mean, the person could pass away, they could, you know, become incapacitated, not able to do the work. They could, you know, go somewhere else. But if you're always thinking about the mission and keeping that as your anchor at every meeting and communicating the ups and downs of what's working, what's not working, that makes for a healthy relationship, a healthy organization, and it will help improve the relationships between board and staff. so that when you do need to make a transition, it's much more of a pleasant experience, and it's not like you're having to drag people into the process or drag people on board. So communication, thinking about the organization holistically, and don't be afraid to embrace change, because change could be very healthy.
Thank you, Marguerite. Natasha, any last words of wisdom you want to share?
I just want to share what Marguerite said. I agree. I mean, it is a lot about, I mean, I think it's a lot about, you know, making sure you're true to your mission. And, you know, what Marguerite said very off the beginning, you know, once you've developed, once you spent time working on your mission and your purpose, then ultimately you're out there to do good on a broader level and to be of service. And that does have to remain a focus. So, and I'm so
Thank you,
glad that this was helpful to grantees and other participants. So thanks for organizing, Consuelo.
Yes,
thank
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marguerite. Thank you, Natasha, for your wisdom. Yay. All right, this concludes this session. It hopefully will be posted to the AL page. Again, I thank Marguerite Griffin and Natasha Holmes for your time. And I thank all of those of you who are on this call for you know, just walking with us as we try to continue to provide capacity building to Black-led and Black-serving organizations in Chicago. And with that, I'm going to officially close us out. And thank you, Carrie and Christine, for your backroom support. You all take care, and thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.